Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Kincaid. I'm the editor-in-chief of Mother Earth Living, and today we are going to be talking about how to grow and process loofah. Loofah is an exfoliating sponge that a lot of people think comes from the ocean, but it's actually a gourd that you let dry on the bush and harvest and process. So we've got some examples of Luffa Gourds here today. This is one that looks, it's fully mature. This is what you want it to look like when you harvest it from the vine. So you can hear some of the seeds rattling around inside. The skin's totally brown and dry. And so this is what you're going for. Loofah is a really long season squash because it needs up to 200 days to reach maturity and dry. So where we're at in Kansas Zone 6A, we are not able to bring our loofah all the way to maturity, and I had to harvest quite a few of mine while they were still green. So you can kind of see some different phases, and the reason why I had to go ahead and harvest them is because we had our first frost last weekend, and if you leave them on the vine after your first frost, then you risk them starting to rot. So loofah, they get pretty big, and they're actually edible when they're young, so you can eat them for a while and then let those that you don't get to keep growing and growing and growing and dry. So to start at the beginning, a little bit about how you grow loofah is that you're going to want to start it inside in flats 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost in the spring. And you're going to grow it just like you would a cucumber, squash, and actually right when they get started, they look exactly like cucumbers. We forgot to label ours with permanent marker. We use regular ink and the labels ran, and we got ours completely mixed up with our cucumbers, and even by the time we set them outside, it was very difficult to tell them apart. So make sure you label them really well. And once you transplant them outside, they like really, really rich soil, so consider adding some compost and mixing it in, and they're definitely gonna need to be on a trellis. I was shocked at how high and quickly these loofah vines grew. We had a 4-foot trellis that was about 3 feet away from a 6-foot high fence. And on the other side of the fence were marshmallow that had grown up to like 7, 8 feet tall. They were huge. And we didn't want to grow our loofah right on the marshmallow because we were worried about them getting like powdery mildew or some sort of rot. But over the course of the growing season, they ended up reaching over both the trellis, the fence, and the marshmallows, and then dangling down huge Luffa Gourds all amongst the marshmallow plants. So they're super vigorous. Get ready to give them a trellis, a sturdy trellis, and a lot of room to grow. They have pretty little yellow flowers, look like squash blossoms. I've heard that if you trim some of the flowers off, you'll get a better yield. We didn't do that this year, and we had more loofah than we knew what to do with. So I'd be curious to experiment with that and see how maybe some of our readers have experienced whether or not that gets them a better yield. So yeah, you water well. As you can see, these suckers get pretty big. That takes a lot of water. So we kept ours consistently watered throughout the season. And then as soon as we had our first frost, we just brought in everything we could. So what you want to do to harvest loofah, this is where it gets really fun because this squash is super unique. If you have a really dry one, if you live in a climate where you're able to get your loofah all the way to maturity, well, first off, good for you, you're lucky. And what you may need to do is soak them for a couple of days in water because as they get drier and drier and drier, the skins can start to kind of suck on and attach to the sponge itself, and it may get kind of difficult and you'll have to pick and peel. So we kind of got one started. Unfortunately, our first frost was 5 days ago, and we had to wait a while to do this video, and in the interim, it started to develop a little bit of mold. So this is a heads up that after you pick your loofah, try to set aside time that afternoon or the very next day to take the peels off and get them drying in a really good environment. So this one, we're not gonna go ahead and process, but I just want you to see that this is what a finished loofah looks like. This is the color you're going for. It's brown and dry. You hear that? It crackles when I hit it. The seeds shake inside of it. That's a mature, done loofah. What we're gonna be processing instead, and which still work and are fine, are some of these that are a little bit lighter green, not quite there yet. So when you're ready to get going, you're gonna take your Luffa gourd and you're gonna whack them to loosen the skin from the squash itself. And this step actually really helps. It loosens them quite a bit. I would not skip this step. And so as I whack it, I can start to feel it gets looser and looser and looser. If they're really dry, you can just kind of snap the top off and start peeling from there. I cut the top just to get a head start for this. But so you start just pulling and separating. The skin from the sponge itself, which will dry and become really a good exfoliator. So one of the kind of crazy things about these loofah squash is that they have these long, kind of like ribs that you can grab and like unzip. So you can kind of like unzip the squash out of its peel. And it's kind of fun and gratifying, and it feels funky. If you're harvesting immature green loofah, then what you may see on the inside is something that looks more like a banana than this exfoliating like stuff. So you can tell when you're harvesting this, if you've seen a loofah sponge at the store, the consistency of this is basically just a wet version of a finished sponge. So I can tell that it's ready, it's at the right stage, it just needs to dry more. So I'm gonna take this all the way off, and you can compost this skin. And you'll see that some of the spots, it's kind of has different coloring going on. There are some areas that are super white, some that are a little bit more brown. Some people choose to dip their loofah in a diluted bleach solution before they let it dry. This helps whiten it consistently, and it can also get rid of some mold or fungus that could develop and taint your collection. So that's not a step I've done, just because I know I'm going to be using these on my skin, and I try to avoid bleach on my skin. But if it's something you're worried about, if maybe if you're giving them as gifts and you want them to be super white and beautiful, or if you're worried about mold developing, then you can go ahead and do that. So once you get your skins all the way off, what we do is I cut them into 3 bits, which is going to make it easier for me to rinse out the pulp inside and all of the seeds. That is what you want to get out of there so that it can dry a little bit quicker. So, and there's a lot of seeds in loofah. I've actually been surprised at how many seeds there are. So I typically do this step over a kitchen sink. We're going to try it just over a bowl here for now. But first I'm going to kind of reach in and see if I can't get some of these extra seeds. And so what you'll see is there are cavities inside of it. There are 5 here. So if you get one that's super juicy and meaty, what I'll do is just take my finger or a chopstick and just hold it under running water and start digging out all that meat and all the seeds. And that's because that is the stuff that's more likely to rot and get moldy as you let it sit out and dry. So I'm gonna rinse it, try to get out some more of those pulp and seeds. And the crazy thing about loofah is when you're rinsing it, it gets, it like suds up and it feels kind of slimy on your hands, almost as though the whole squash is coated in aloe or something. So the whole processing loofah, the whole thing is just a really kind of interesting textural experience. You get the exfoliating sponge on the outside, the crazy zipper that you kind of rip off and unwrap, and then you'll see, do you see all those bubbles on there? It looks as though I've been rinsing this in soap, but it's not. It's just the properties of that slimy loofah coming off. So that's part of the reason why you rinse it too, is to just try and get it clean and ready to dry. Anything that could mold while you're drying is what you're trying to get rid of. Okay, so if I had a sink here, I would take my my wand and really put it right up against it and try to shoot out more seeds and pulp. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and call this good. And so I'm gonna set this here and process the seeds and pulp out of these. And when you're done, when you've processed all the loofah that you want, you can dip it in the diluted bleach solution and then set it outside to dry. We plan on giving ours a solid 3 weeks to dry in the sun. It's been getting pretty cold here at night though, so we've been bringing ours in at night just as a safety precaution. We'd hate to do all this work and then lose them. So we're gonna let them sit for about 3 weeks. And then at that point, we're gonna have our finished loofah sponge. And you can use these in the bathroom, in the shower, if you wanna use it instead of like a washcloth or a sponge. You can use it in the kitchen for doing dishes. You can scrub your floors with it, clean your car with it, whatever. Basically anything that you would use a sponge for, you can use this for. And when you're done with it, you can compost it. And if you want to keep reusing them a couple times, you can try dipping them in a bleach solution to clean and sanitize, re-dry them, and go at it again. One note, we've tried a couple different techniques for cleaning out some of the pulp. And we did, at one point, we took the squash and just cut everything out of the middle. We just went around like this, all the way around the edge, and hollowed it out because we were worried that if we left too much seeds and pulp, it wouldn't dry properly. The problem with doing that is that you remove some of the structure that keeps the loofah intact, and it's easier to squish it and it gets flat. So I would recommend trying not to hollow the whole thing out unless you really just have so many seeds and so much pulp that you don't know how to clean it otherwise. But I think you'll be fine. We figured it out after a couple goes. Another fun thing that you can do with this loofah squash is to cut it into little discs and then drop the discs into soap molds and pour your homemade soap over it, and then you have soap that has a built-in exfoliator inside of it. So that's something we look forward to doing this year, and it's also going to be a great gift. Yeah, okay, so people are curious about the zone that we're in and the distance between plants. So we're in Kansas, zone 6A. We were able to grow loofah, but as I mentioned earlier, it didn't reach, very few of them reached full maturity. This is the only one we had that actually turned brown and dried on the vine. So this is what you're going for. So those who are in warmer climates are gonna have an easier time of it. Their loofah is gonna dry on the vine. It's gonna be easier to process. And it takes about 200 days to reach maturity. Here in Kansas, we start the seeds indoors and transplant them out in spring. Even though in Kansas or in colder climates, your loofah may not reach total maturity, you can still grow it and harvest the loofah when they're immature. The loofah is edible when it's young, so eat it like as you would a squash. You can saute it, put it in salads, and then as it gets older, harvest it and do the sponge. So we were harvesting, when we had our first frost here in Kansas, zone 6A, this is what some of them looked like, all the way up to yellow and green, and then the super brown one. So you'll have to experiment, and some of ours weren't even at the point where we could process them at all. I cut them open, tried to peel it back, and I basically had what felt like a banana in my hands. It was weird because the skin still peels off really easily, which is you wouldn't get with a typical squash or a cucumber. But what you have left is, if it's too immature, it won't have any of this little exfoliator skin on the outside. So, and then as far as planting distance, we did ours about 2 feet apart on a trellis. We had probably 15 plants. They germinated really easily, were super healthy, transplanted them outside, and they just took off. So we had about 15 plants, and we got easily enough loofah to get my family through for a year of all of our sponges and to also give us gifts. Our kitchen countertop was piled with them, and they're pretty big. I mean, you can see that these are, you can get quite a bit out of that, especially if you wanted to. You could cut them smaller than this. You could cut them into discs. You could open them up and flatten them out and have like a flat sponge and make it go that much further. So yeah, I would say about 10. I bet we got probably 2 loofahs per plant, 2 to 3. But they're huge. And also, one other thing I want to point out is that part of the reason why you want to use a trellis is because if they're raised, they'll grow straight and they'll form nicely. If they're bumping up against the ground, they'll start to kind of peel or start to kind of turn, and it makes them harder to process and cut up. And then you also have sponges that are crooked. So that's one of the other main reasons why you want to make sure you trellis them really well. That's a great question. I got mine from Fedco. I really like Fedco. I have amazing germination rates. with stuff that I get from them. I really like them. I also noticed some from, I believe, Strictly Medicinal, used to be Horizon, carries them. And there's different spellings for loofah. I was seeing Luffa quite a bit. Sometimes people put an H on the end. We've seen Loofa. So maybe try a couple different spellings when you're on these seed sites. But it's a gourd, and I had really good luck with Fedco. If you have to pick them early due to frost, is that it? Are they ruined, or can you go ahead and process them and they're fine? And that's a great question, and that's a lot of what we've been experimenting with this year, because here in Kansas we had to pick ours immature. So these finished ones that you'll see here are from immature, like technically immature ones, but they're not a write-off. You can still process them just fine. You're gonna have to make sure you really rinse the pulp out. The drier they get, the darker the seeds get, which is kind of interesting, and then also the less amount of pulp you'll have inside. So if you're harvesting immature ones, you're just gonna have to make sure you really rinse the pulp and the seeds out very well, and that you lay them outside to dry for about 3 weeks. I've read that the exfoliate, the sponges from immature loofah will be not as hard as the sponges from the more mature brown loofah. But mine has so far been drying for about 4 or 5 days, and it's as hard and exfoliant as I would expect it to be or would need it to be. So I haven't seen a difference in the quality of the sponges. It's just a little bit more processing time. But yeah, you can absolutely harvest your loofah when they're still green. Okay, so that's gonna wrap up how you grow, harvest, and process loofah. We're gonna be covering this topic in depth in the March-April issue of Mother Earth Living 2018. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more, please pick up that copy and dive in. Thank you.